Perception is how we humans come to know things about the world. We use our senses to gain information about the external world, and we come to hold beliefs about it, which then inform the actions we make. However, for such a basic aspect of our experiential lives, the phenomenon of perception is also one of the most puzzling things about consciousness. Just how exactly does the external world impress itself on our senses in such a way that we come to form an inner conscious experience about what the external world is like? And if there really is such a separation between our conscious experience and what goes on outside it, then how can we ever know that our perception is giving us accurate information about the external world at all? All these problems and more have got philosophers thinking about just what perception is, so in this video, let's take a look at some theories of perception. And for some added stakes, I'll be taking a shot each time I fail to prove the existence of the external world. I mean, I wrote this script, so I know fully well how this will turn out, so this video is basically an excuse to get pissed. Look, it's been a rough week, okay? It all starts with a theory called direct realism. In direct realism, there are two components involved in perception: the perceiver and the perceived object. When the perceiver looks at something, for example this table, there is a direct and unmediated awareness of this object, and it will continue to exist even when the perceiver looks away from it. In other words, the perceived object exists in the world exactly as we perceive it, unless, of course, your intuitions have been destroyed in the industrial shredder that is a philosophy degree. It's in tune with common sense, it avoids skepticism rather nicely, and it gives a clear account as to how we come to know things about the world. We can be sure that trees are green, sugar is sweet, and fleshlights are squishy, because all these objects actually have the properties we perceive them to have. Simples, right? Well, perhaps it's a little bit too simple. Imagine that you're sitting at the table for your breakfast vodka and orange, and inside the glass is a straw. You might notice that the straw appears bent. Of course, the straw isn't bent in reality, but the refraction of light makes the straw appear bent. This is a problem for direct realism, called the argument from illusion. If we have a direct awareness of a bent straw, but the straw isn't bent in reality, then how direct can our perception really be? Another problem comes with the argument from hallucination. Often when someone experiences a hallucination, such as that tab of acid that's just a tad bit stronger than advertised, it's difficult or impossible to tell apart the hallucination from a veridical perception. If the hallucination is indistinguishable from a veridical perception, but the hallucination only exists within the mind, then it follows that our normal perceptions must be within the mind as well. There are even more problems for direct realism, such as perceptual variation, when a square appears as a diamond when viewed from an angle, and the time lag argument, how we can never really have a direct awareness of the external world because light takes a certain amount of time to reach our eyes, and even longer to be processed in the brain. It seems as though perception is not as simple as direct realism claims, and that calls for my first shot of this video. Oh, that's awful. Alright, so direct realism can't demonstrate the existence of the external world, so let's examine a more complex theory of perception: indirect realism. Like direct realism, indirect realism is a realist theory, which means that objects actually exist in the world. However, there are now three components involved in perception: the perceiver, the perceived object, and the appearance of the perceived object. When we look at the table, what we're directly aware of is not the table itself, but rather how the table appears in our consciousness. Our perceptions are now separated into primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities resemble the actual qualities of the table, such as its size, shape, and mass. In other words, if different scientists were to undertake a scientific investigation of the table, all of them would agree on their measurements. However, secondary qualities, such as the color, texture, and smell, do not resemble the table. If we say the table is white, what we really mean is that the table has the power to cause the sensation of white in us, but that it's not really white itself. In other words, the secondary qualities of the table are mind dependent, because a consciousness is required in order to experience them. So the next time someone asks you if a tree falling in the woods with nobody around to hear it makes a sound, tell them to firstly piss right off, and secondly no, because sound is a secondary quality and is therefore mind dependent. So, this seems like a better theory. Has the external world been shown to exist? Unfortunately, not. Indirect realism essentially drives a wedge between how objects appear to us and how they actually are. Although this solves a lot of the problems that direct realism faces, it also creates some of its own. Because indirect realism creates this distance between appearance and reality, called the veil of perception, we can be skeptical about the existence of anything outside our own consciousness. If we only have access to appearance, and appearance is mind dependent, then we can have no knowledge about stuff outside our minds, or whether anything exists outside our minds at all. We can imagine, for instance, that some evil scientist has plugged electrodes into our brains and is feeding us electrical impulses that mimic the sound of birdsong, or the colours of the sunset, or the feel of the condom that's ribbed for her pleasure. This thought experiment is called the brain in a vat, a more modern version of the Cartesian evil demon. And if something like this is theoretically possible, then it seems as though indirect realism has been ruled out too. You know what that means? It's time for me to take another shot, and for you to watch my life slowly fall apart. Oh, don't start a philosophy degree, kids. This is where it gets you. It's a gateway drug. So, both direct and indirect realism are bollocks. What's next? Well, the last theory we'll examine is called idealism, and it's a little bit more radical than the other two. In idealism, there are only two components involved with perception, the perceiver and ideas. You might have noticed that idealism drops the realist name, and this is because with idealism, there are no such things as mind-independent objects that exist in the world, only ideas. What? Basically, idealism tries to collapse the primary-secondary quality distinction that indirect realism established, and it does this using quite an ingenious thought experiment. Imagine once more our table, but this time let's remove all its sensible qualities. Subtract the colour, texture, taste, smell, and sound. What's left once we have this invisible, intangible, tasteless, unsmellable, and silent table? Well, nothing really, and that's exactly the point. Without the sensible secondary qualities, we're left with no access to the table at all. Therefore, all we have access to are ideas inside our own minds, and there are no such things as objects in an external world. For the idealist, the whole world is mind-dependent. Great, the table and the external world exist inside my consciousness as ideas. Is the video over yet? Not quite, I need the ad revenue in order to eat. Even though it seems like the idealists have been smoking DMT with Joe Rogan, their theory is actually more simple than both direct and indirect realism. By eliminating matter, there's one less assumption we need to make when it comes to perception, and according to Occam's razor, the simplest solution is often the better one. If you're wondering what reason we have to prefer ideas over matter, the idealist would respond by asking what reason we have to prefer matter over ideas. Both assumptions are equally absurd, and if we don't need to worry about the external world in idealism, then it's really the more efficient theory. However, there is still an issue here. If the external world is merely an idea inside the mind, then idealism seems to lead us straight into solipsism, and we can doubt the existence of anything besides our own consciousness. Your hands, your dog, and even other people might be figments of your imagination. Idealism can be rescued if we appeal to the existence of God, but since most philosophers nowadays are a little hesitant to do that, it's generally assumed that idealism still leads us into solipsism, and we become trapped inside our own mind, shut off from the rest of the world. So, the external world still doesn't exist, and that calls for my third and final shot. Right, time to end the video. Death is near. It's time to wrap this up. So, where does this leave us? Well, after this brief whistle-stop tour over the various theories of perception, I think we can be reasonably sure that the external world exists in some form or another. Philosophers have offered various arguments about the existence of the external world, such as how we have little control over what we actually perceive. No amount of conscious effort can stop the perception when you walk in on your parents mid-shag, and if our perception was really the result of our own conscious activity, then it seems like we'd be able to do something about it. Even though we can't be absolutely certain about what exists outside our own minds, the best explanation is that our senses and nervous system have allowed us to track the environment with a fair amount of accuracy, otherwise our chances of survival would be very unlikely. Skepticism is all well and good, but it's the difference between a razor and a butcher's knife when having your morning shave. They'll both get the job done, but one's just a little better for the job than the other. There's still much more scientific investigation to be done on just how our perception works, but until that time when we know for certain, you never know. You could just be a brain in a vat, drifting around space, having all your sensations fed to you through wires. Thank you very much for watching, peace and love, and I'll see you in the next video.